This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners, who support us at patreon.com, and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is How to End Family Policing, From Outrage to Action. From leading abolitionist organizers, a much-needed intervention arguing that the systems that purport to protect children make them and our communities less safe. Based on decades of shared organizing, study, and lived experience, the contributors to How to End Family Policing argue that the child welfare system cannot build genuine safety. Rather than the misleading language of child welfare and child protective services, scholars and activists use the term family policing to name the fact that these institutions and practices are neither neutral nor benign. Offering first-person testimony and laying out visions for alternatives, this book is an urgent call to build flourishing communities. Find How to End Family Policing at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is the second episode of Nusantara, a series on the history of Indonesia. Nusantara is a word that refers to the vast geographic archipelago that only through centuries of colonial capitalism and the struggles against it became a nation, one whose boundaries, identities, and purpose remain contested to this day. This is a lengthy introduction that I think will be greatly helpful to you in understanding the complexities of the interview that follows. In other words, I recommend that you do not fast forward. A man named Cokro Aminoto and his wife ran a boarding house in the Javanese city of Surabaya, caring for youth away from home pursuing their education. In the 19-teens, Cokro became the leader of the first Indonesian mass organization, Sarekat Islam, or Islamic Union. Incredibly enough, through that house of this monumental leader passed a cohort of young men who would go on to lead many of the currents of early 20th century Indonesian politics. Leaders of the Indonesian Communist Party, Samaun, Alamin, Musso, and Tan Malaka. The leader of the Darul Islam Islamist guerrilla army, Kartosuwiryo, and Sukarno, the principal leader of the Indonesian Revolution, and then of the independent Indonesian Republic. Indeed, Sukarno was a principal leader of the entire Third Worldist anti-colonial movement right up until he was overthrown in Suharto's 1965 U.S.-backed military coup and anti-communist mass murder, a cataclysmic trauma that imposed more than 3 decades of reactionary U.S.-aligned New Order dictatorship. This episode begins at the dawn of the 20th century. The Dutch had instituted the ethical policy, which somewhat liberalized colonial administration, including by extending education to Indonesian natives who made up a new layer of social class called the Lesser Priayi, who gained status through Western education rather than lineage. That's in contrast to the Priayi, or traditional aristocratic elite. This is where we left off in episode 1. This layer of new Indonesian elite was educated to become colonial administrators, educated as close to home as Surabaya and as far away as the Netherlands. But this lower elite layer, a layer that was stuck in between the colonial and aristocratic indigenous elite on the one hand and the colonized masses on the other, this new elite instead rebelled and led the way into Indonesia's anti-colonial modernity. The first decades of the 20th century became known as the Awakening Period, a flourishing of lower Priayi elite consciousness and organization, which then cascaded into a series of mass organizations and parties, newspapers and books, and multifarious ideological development. The movements were politically diverse and don't always neatly fit categories we're accustomed to in the West. In 1908, Javanese elites founded Budi Otomo, a politically moderate organization dedicated to reviving pre-colonial Javanese culture. Soon after, the more radical Indonesia, or Indies Party, was formed, the first nationalist organization dedicated to anti-colonialism and Indonesian independence. Newspapers flourished. The circulation of print news and literature helped foster a budding national consciousness. Benedict Anderson, the author of the classic book Imagined Communities, gained this insight in part from his long years studying Indonesia. Perhaps the most famous early moment in this awakening took place in 1913, when Suwardi, an intellectual of royal lineage, published If I Were a Dutchman, mocking the colonizer for commemorating the centenary of their own liberation from Napoleonic France while holding Indonesia in captivity. Suwardi was exiled to the Netherlands alongside fellow early nationalist leaders Djipto Mangunkusumo and also Ernest Duis Dekker, an Indo or Eurasian. As it happens, he was also the grandnephew of Edward Duis Dekker, a Dutchman who, writing under the pseudonym Multatuli, was the author of the 1860 novel that we discussed in episode 1 entitled Max Havelaar, which exposed the brutality of Dutch colonialism to a broad public. In the Netherlands, the Indonesian student movement was crafting the very concept of Indonesia as a nation. In 1922, students in cities like Leiden formed Indische Vereniging, Indies Union, renamed Indonesische Vereniging, Indonesian Union, in 1925. In 1928, youth from various organizations gathered for the Indonesian Youth Congress and issued the Youth Pledge, Sumpah Pemuda, pledging to recognize one nation, one people, one language. That language, Bahasa Indonesia, was not the Javanese spoken by the residents of the archipelago's population center, but rather taken from Low Malay, a language common to the marketplace. Later, upon his return to Indonesia, Suwardi would shed his royal title and change his name to Dewantara. In 1922, he founded Taman Siswa, a network of progressive schools drawing from Montessori principles, autonomous from colonial authority. The Dutch pejoratively labeled them, along with communist schools of the 1920s, wild schools, and in 1932, cracked down with restrictions. The awakening took the consequential step toward becoming a mass phenomenon with the foundation of Sarekat Dagang Islam, the Islamic trade union, in various cities beginning in 1905. Islam was in the name of the organization, not really because the organization was religious, but rather because Islam marked the indigenous identity of the Indonesian traders involved. Indonesian traders advocating for themselves vis-a-vis Chinese Indonesian traders and, more broadly, a larger colonial order that was stacked against them. In 1912, the Islamic Trade Union became simply the Islamic Union, Sarekat Islam, or SI. The SI broke new ground, finding a mass base among the common people, known as the Kromo. They found that base under the charismatic leadership of Cokro Aminoto, who took on the mythic status of a Javanese just king. A figure like Prince Diponegoro, who led the Indonesian forces in the 1825 to 1830 Java War, which we discussed last episode, a war whose loss had led to the construction of the modern Dutch East Indies colonial state. The awakening, however, was radicalizing, and Cokro's students would help lead the way, including by building the communist movement. That story begins with Dutch socialist Henk Sneevliet, who had moved to Indonesia from the metropole and become a leading figure in the Railway Workers' Union as part of his mission to bring anti-capitalist and anti-colonial struggle to the archipelago. Sneevliet was an active trade unionist in the Netherlands, but grew disillusioned with the conservative, reformist nature of the Dutch labor movement and Dutch socialism. He also struggled to find work in the home country, which prompted his relocation to the Indies. In 1914, he founded the Indies Social Democratic Association, or ISDV. In 1918, Sneevliet was expelled from Indonesia and took on a peripatetic life in the struggle for global communism. including by playing a key role in the founding of the CCP, the Communist Party of China. He was a leader in the global communist movement until he was murdered by the Nazis in 1942. But by the time of Sneevliet's expulsion, major Indonesian leadership had already emerged to lead this new communist movement. Among those indigenous PKI leaders were Semaun and also Tan Malaka. Tan Malaka, after his own 1922 expulsion from Indonesia, would, like Sneevliet, take on a globe-trotting life of communist struggle until his own execution by the Indonesian military in 1949. After Semaun's expulsion, he lived for 3 decades in the Soviet Union before returning to Indonesia, where he ultimately broke with the PKI. In 1920, ISDV was renamed the Communist Union of the Indies, and then, in 1924, the Communist Party of Indonesia, or PKI. The rise of the PKI precipitated a split in Sarekat Islam between a communist-aligned left faction and an anti-communist faction. As the anti-communist faction withered, the communist-aligned faction called Sarekat Merah, Red Union, and later Sarekat Rakyat, People's Union, would work closely with the PKI. It's important to note here that the PKI remained a small organization compared to the People's Union. Really, the communist movement in the 1920s is better understood as a Pergerakan Merah, a red movement, a united front of popular radical struggles against colonialism in which numerous organizations, unions, and political parties mobilized under the banner of communism. In 1926, the PKI launched a poorly conceived rebellion and was crushed, the party and its leadership suppressed. It would be the first of the PKI's historic defeats. The second would be the Madiun Affair, a communist revolt amid the National Revolution in 1948. The third and final would be 1965, when Suharto's coup unleashed a systematic mass murder campaign against hundreds of thousands of communists and accused communists. The communists were one of 3 major mass forces that emerged in early 20th century Indonesian society. The second was nationalism, specifically Sukarnoism. It was 1 year after the first PKI rebellion that Sukarno founded the Indonesian National Party, or PNI, first and briefly called the Indonesian National Association. Sukarno, a master synthesizer who drew upon Javanese culture's powerful syncretism, he wove together an Indonesian form of nationalism that also sought to harmonize with communism and Islam. Indeed, in 1926, Sukarno wrote an article entitled Nationalism, Islam, and Marxism. The term Nasakam, which stands for Nationalism, Religion, and Communism, would be a leading principle of his final years in office during the guided democracy period. Sukarno was a charismatic leader of the highest order, capable over the decades of rallying masses of people at the front of the rally or through a radio broadcast. The nationalist movement also had a more intellectual wing, oriented towards administration and technocracy. This tendency of nationalism was led most importantly by Syahrir and Hatta, 2 men from West Sumatra, from the Minangkabau people who, like a generational cohort of nationalist founders, had studied abroad in the Netherlands. As scholars of this period often describe it, Sukarno would be a leading solidarity maker. Syahrir and Hatta would be leading managerialists. I want to pause and break down some differences between Java and Sumatra. Indonesia as one country was, once again, it was an unstable and incomplete confection of Dutch colonialism and the struggles against it. And you should interpret the history that we're telling here through that lens. Differences between different islands, political economy, ideology, religion, language, culture. These differences could be enormous. They remain often enormous today. So, Java was a plantation colony that was run by the state. The Dutch colonial authorities co-opted the Javanese royal bureaucracy to enforce indentured labor on peasants. The Javanese economy was also highly fragmented as a result of tax farming run by Chinese Indonesians, which effectively choked off the emergence of a Javanese petit bourgeois or petit capitalist class. By contrast, Sumatra was conquered only by the end of the 19th century, and while East Sumatra became a plantation colony, it had to import laborers from Java and China. Aside from mining and oil, Dutch colonialism did not penetrate deep into Sumatran society. Indigenous trade continued, especially amongst Minangkabauans, who maintained an extensive network of migrants throughout the archipelago and Malaya. These differences shaped different forms of revolutionary politics. The nationalist elites from Sumatra came from a trading class, from petit bourgeois families, while their Javanese counterparts came from feudal or colonial bureaucratic classes. And due to this different form of colonialism, the Javanese generally developed a stronger class consciousness and were more sympathetic to Marxist ideas or to communism, while Sumatrans were generally more conservative and supported a more Islamic notion of nationalism. That, of course, is a big generalization. Many communists, like Tan Malaka, were also of Sumatran origin. Okay. The third major current of the awakening of early 20th century Indonesian politics was the Islamic movement, or movements. First, Islamic modernism, a new orthodoxy spreading across the Muslim world, made its way into Indonesia, calling for a return to an austere Islam unadorned by centuries of local tradition. Meanwhile, the guardians of more traditional syncretic forms of Javanese Islam pushed back, defending a system of religious boarding schools run by figures known as kiai, who were often also major landlords. The modernists organized into Muhammadiyah, the traditionalists into Nahdlatul Ulama, or NU, which means revival of the ulama, or revival of the religious scholars. There are a couple other relevant features of Islamic society and politics during this era that I should note. First, a growing number of Indonesians, particularly in Java, were abangan, meaning nominal Muslims, who identified as Muslims and performed some religious obligations, but lived substantially non-religious lives. Second, there were multiple forms of thought that sought to meld or reconcile socialism or communism with Islam, including from Tan Malaka, who argued against Lenin at the Comintern, making the case for supporting pan-Islamism. In 1965, the landlord Islamic leaders of Nahdlatul Ulama, or NU, would help the military carry out its anti-communist slaughter against communist-aligned peasants who demanded redistribution. But for the first 3 decades of the 20th century, things were far more fluid. Much of the Dutch colonial establishment soon soured on the ethical policy because it had, in fact, backfired, nurturing a new anti-colonial elite leadership that was turning Indonesian society upside down. The 1930s was a period of repression. The PKI was suppressed after its failed rebellion. Sukarno and other PNI leaders were arrested in 1931, and the party for the meantime disbanded. Syahrir and Hato would lead a party called Indonesian Nationalist Education, or the New PNI, PNI Baru. Sukarno allies also formed the Indonesia Party, Partindo, itself dissolved in 1936. In this climate of repression, 2 parties adopted a cooperative stance with the Dutch, working within the Volksraad, an advisory legislative body operating under tight colonial controls. The left-wing Gerindo, which absorbed former members of Sukarno's Partindo, and the right-wing Parindra, led by Soetomo, the founder in 1908 of Bodiutomo. That's where we leave our story in episode 2 of Nusantara. Next episode, episode 3, will pick up with the Japanese imperial occupation of Indonesia and the beginning of the end of the colonial Dutch East Indies. My guests are once again Rianne Subijanto and Mada Supriatma, and for this episode, we are now joined by Farabi Fakih. In later discussions, we'll also be joined by Ikra Anugrah. Before we get rolling, please support this podcast at patreon.com/thedig. As you can probably see from the series, and really even just from that introduction that I just read, and from other such work that we've done, we put everything into these podcasts. Every episode of a series like this requires a ton of work, and that's only possible for me to do for a living, and for me to pay my team who make it all possible. That's only possible thanks to support from listeners like you. If you can give a little, give a little. If you can give a lot, well, give a lot. All of that is what makes it possible to put the pod out paywall free so that it reaches the maximum number of people possible, regardless of their ability or even inclination to contribute. Plus, we have so much swag. That's patreon.com/thedig. There's a link in the show notes. Please click it. Also, I'm throwing some more dig parties. The party in London was so much fun. Thank you to everyone who came. Next up, Seattle and LA. The dig party in Seattle will be Wednesday, May 20th from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. at Stoop Brewing, co-sponsored with How's Our Neighbors. The dig party in LA, May 26th. 6 p.m. onwards at Audiograph Beer Co. And that's co-sponsored by DSALA and the National Day Laborer Organizing Network, or NDLON. I hope to see all of you Seattleites and Angelinos in May. There are links in the show notes for RSVPing. Please do click them and RSVP. Okay. Here's Rianne Subijanto, Mada Supriatma, and Farabi Fakih for episode 2 of Nusantara, a series on the history of Indonesia. Farabi, who goes by Abi, comes in partway through the episode. Rianne Subijanto is a professor of communication studies at Baruch College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's the author of Communication Against Capital, Red Enlightenment at the Dawn of Indonesia, and a co-editor of The Indonesian Left in the 20th Century, Beyond the Rise and Fall of a Party. She also serves as an editor for the Indonesian left media Indoprogress.com. Mada Supriatma is a visiting research fellow at the Izias Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. He specializes in Indonesian politics, civil-military relations, ethnic conflict, and state bureaucracy. Farabi Fakih is the head of the master's program in the history department at Gadjah Mada University in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. He's worked on the history of the decolonization of the Indonesian state and is working on a manuscript on the history of natural resource management, particularly oil and gas. During this same period, in the first decade of the 20th century, Indonesian popular organization and consciousness were undergoing just really explosive changes. New organizations, new newspapers, the formation of a more elitist, more Dutch-aligned organization called Budi Utomo. There was the nationalist and pro-independence Indies Party, Indonesia Party, which was particularly popular, I think, among Indo-Europeans. And most notably, there was Syarikat Islam, or Islamic Union, SI. Founded in 1909, SI became the first real national organization with a mass base. And it was led by a really pivotal figure that you mentioned earlier, Made, named Omar Said Djokro-Minoto. There were tons of different religious and ethnic organizations. There were peasant rebellions, including on Java, a spiritual peasant movement that challenged Dutch power known as the Salmonists. It was also that decade, the first decade of the 20th century, when the first labor union was established, representing state railway workers, the Railway Workers Union, or VSTP. This is really the beginning of a period of a flowering of all sorts of nationalist, communist, Islamist organization, but this decade is really the first moment in this longer development over the decades that follow of key nationalist, socialist, and communist and Islamic organization lay this out, this first generation of Indonesian nationalist and quasi-nationalist organization. Why did this this efflorescence of organization and consciousness take place when it did, and how did these various currents moving among various segments of the Indonesian elite, how did those currents begin in this period to connect with the broad masses?
So the ethical policy opened up the rights for association and assembly among the natives that used to be prevented, that used to be restricted, right, for this group. So on the one hand, we have the ethical policy. In the Indonesian history, we call it the awakening period, kebangkitan, periode kebangkitan, right? So the first decade of the 1900s, we saw a burgeoning of political associations, parties, trade unions, some of them that you have already mentioned, the Budi Utomo nationalists, Indonesia Party, that actually are, Budi Utomo is very much Javanese and nationalist, but the nationalist Javanese. They wanted to revive Javanese values from before colonialism, right? And then there is the Indonesia Party that is actually campaigning for direct independence. And then there is also Insulinde, which was actually mobilized by Indo-European. Then we also have trade unions like VSTP that you mentioned, the railway workers union. Also during this time, in 1911, the Qing dynasty in China was, for the first time, after centuries, was able to be overthrown by the Republicans led by Sun Yat-sen. And so a lot of the Chinese people in the Dutch East Indies was actually organizing among themselves as well for this nationalist cause through the use of newspapers. And so a lot of the natives, they model after the Chinese also by mobilizing people through association and the production of newspapers. This is the print capitalism, but also how print basically became the handmaiden of nationalist ideas and nationalist struggle, right? Now, what we're seeing then is, native priais, the lesser priai classes, that they mobilized, they created associations, but also newspapers. We have, for example, Tirto Adi Suryo, who Pramudia Anantatur called Sang Pemula, or the pioneer. He is the first journalist, of natives, and he created a number of newspapers called Medan Priai, one of them. And then there is also Mas Marco, who became a prolific writer, wrote about history of Indonesia, Babat Jawa and all that. And there's also Haji Misbah. Haji Misbah is this religious leader who created Islam Bergerak, right? So we're seeing this burgeoning, thriving and exciting moment of natives being able to express their ideas. One thing that I think is monumental was in 1913, Suwardi Suryaningrat, which Mada mentioned before, or Ki Hajar Dewantara, he wrote an article in Dutch. And then in Dutch it says, als ik eens Nederlander was, which means that if I were Dutch. So imagine this native writer wrote in a newspaper an article about if I were Dutch. How could I celebrate the Dutch kingdom, however many years of Dutch kingdom's birthday, in this place that they have been colonized and extracted, etc., etc. That's basically, it's a satire, right? And so, but if I were Dutch is so powerful because it was also translated into native. So James Siegel talked about how this idea of I, right, when it was the ik, in Dutch, ik means I or saya, right? When it was translated into saya and it was read by regular public, it allowed the native suddenly to now oscillate between the different persona. Now the native could imagine that they are free, that they are powerful, just like a Dutchman. That they're no longer, the colonized, passive, and suffering ik, saya, or I, they adopted this free and empowered subjectivity. And when this article was circulated among the lower class people, this I also then become a we also that was able to then organized the spirit of bergerak or movement, because this is also known as an age in motion, which is zaman bergerak, right? So because of this article, actually Surwadi, Suryaningrat, the tiga serangkai, the three leaf clover, that's what is they're known as that. Cipto Mangun Kusumo, and then Ernst Dawes Dekker and Ki Hajar Dewantara, they were sent in exile because of this article, and because Indonesia Party, they campaigned for independent Indonesia. Actually, a side note, Ki Hajar Dewantara later translated the song Internationale into Malay. But anyway, so that was, the beginning again of of the spirit of freedom and nationalism, right? Then came late 1900s and the turn to 1910s, the teens, right? Now, actually, Sarekat Islam or the Islamic Union was not founded by Cokro. It was started in different places. So it started actually by Tirto Adisuryo. I mentioned he was the pioneer, our pioneer, the journalist. He created Sarekat Dagang Islam, the Islamic Trade Union. And then convinced Haji Samanhudi, another person in Surakarta, to create the same party, which is Islamic Trade Union. The idea is basically to create this union for batik traders so that they could support their trade against the threat of the more successful Chinese traders, right? And they call it Islam because it was just an identity that was basically native, right? And then so for a long time, that was basically what Sarekat Dagang Islam was, the Islamic Trade Union. And then in Surabaya, Cokro led his own SDI, and then because he's firebrand in nature, he also changed the tone of SDI into a more anti-colonial, it's less about just trade. It's no longer something local, but it's about anti-colonial freedom. And so then that changed the direction and changed the party into the so-called Islamic Union, so Sarekat Islam. It's so important to remember during this time, though, that Sarekat Islam, Islamic Union, was still very much also, they were able to mobilize the so-called kromo. So kromo is an identity that is often contrasted with priyayi. This kromo means orang kecil, little people who have no ranks or status. They were, you can't really use the proletariat, right? So, but this actually is an identity that describes most of native people. But Islamic Union for a long time, especially under Cokro. So Cokro made Islamic Union to be very popular, not just in Java, but outside of Java because of his firebrand nature and this anti-colonial spirit. But Cokro was seen as this Ratu Adil or just king. So Islamic Union was still very much, mystical at the time. They were run more by looking at this messianic figure. This is still traditional in organization. You mentioned Saminism, right? So it's very much still Javanese and very much traditional Javanese kind of seeing a leader. And it's still only led by one leader. And we're seeing later how this will change as we shift toward more to 1920s.
Yeah, I think I want to just add a little bit about from different perspective literatures and its publication. I think we are in that tier with the Chinese because they are among the first who open publishers publishing newspaper, printing novels, something. And interestingly, it using the lower Malay language. It's not the Japanese, which is the biggest population in the archipelago, but it's using the lower Malay language. And this Pramudia Anandatur published a book about the early Indonesian Chinese literatures in 1963, which is I think that against the idea that right now a lot of Indonesian nationalists, or I think in the history book, people say that the Indonesian literature started from the Netherlands East Indies publication Balai Pustaka. But Pramudia's argued, no, it's not. It started way earlier, in the early 90s, by publication of the Chinese. And I think this is also, Rianne also mentioned that Ki Hajar Dewantara translate the If I'm a Dutchman, not to Japanese, but to Malay. That's the adoption of Malay. That's because of the early publication by the Chinese merchants who opened the printing business, publication business, newspapers business. It makes it easier for the natives or for the people in the archipelago knows each other, can communicate with each other, not by using the biggest ethnic group in the archipelago, but using the language of the market at the time, especially among the natives, even the Dutch using it. So, and also a lot of schools using Malay, Lower Malay, as the introductory language. Of course, this is also the sekolah. There's a lot of what you call it? Sekolah liar at the time.
Wilde scholar.
Yeah, Wilde scholar, the sekolah liar, the unregistered,
Wild schools.
yeah, wild school. That's the translation. Also the sastra liar. A lot of things that's categorically liar, which is a very, very popular at that time. Liar means it's unofficial, or wild, uncontrollable by the government at that time. I think this contributes a lot. And also, I want to highlight that this age, the early 19th century, is called what Semaun said, that the Zaman Bergerak, was Anna say, the age in motion, which is also it's a very beautiful history book by Japanese scholars, Takashi Shiraishi, titled exactly the same, The Age in Motion, which is depicting what's going on at that time, not only at the elite level, but also at the mass level. Cokro Aminoto become the Just King, the Ratu Adil, which is a kind of a prophet, yeah, for the natives. But at that time also, is a very popular word at that time is vergathering, gathering. Yeah, gathering of the people. This is the first time that people are gathered outside their communities, gathered for a cause. For example, if they are farmers, they are gathered because of their farmers, not because of they are in this, coming from the same village, but because they are farmers, because they are workers, because they are shoemakers, because they are textile workers or something like that. So a very popular word at the time, and also people are talking about communism and Islamism in the same breath. You know, it's not so much different between the communism and Islamism and Islam at that time. So I think it's not also ideology, but also the perception, the belief that something big is undergoing within the society. Something big will come, and that kind of imagination is really scared the Dutch.
In 1914, Dutch socialist Henk Sneevliet founded the Indies Social Democratic Association, or ISDV, which would later become the Communist Party of Indonesia, or PKI. At the time, Sneevliet was a member of the Dutch Social Democratic Workers' Party, or SDAP, the Dutch party of the Socialist Second International. Who was Sneevliet, and what at this time was the SDAP's orientation toward the Dutch East Indies colony and the right to self-determination of the people who lived there?
Right. So Social Democratic Workers' Party, SDAP, was a dominant socialist party in the Netherlands. they also had SDAP branch in the Dutch East Indies. So many of the socialists in the Dutch East Indies were were a minority. But if there were socialists, they were either with the SDAP or they were also active in their own trade unions, teachers union or naval personnel union. And what is so important to note here, all of these were only open for Europeans, not even Indo-Europeans, not even the Eurasian could join this. Now, SDAP, their stance, even in the Netherlands, so they were a part of the Second International, right? Both the First International, in which Marx was a part of and quickly became a leader, or even though he didn't found it in the mid 1800s. Both the First International and then later Second International, both of them did not have any agenda on colonialism. And both of them they still believe in this idea of transition, how both capitalism is a form of transition and also then communism also is a form of transition. What it means is that in order for us to achieve, these people believe that in order for us to achieve socialism, we need to modernize the colony, that colonialism is actually civilizing and positive, and colonialism created a condition for effective socialism, right? And that, again, with this idea of transition then...
Stagism.
Yes, stagism, exactly. You call it stagism or this idea of transition, but the process of the proletarianization of peasantry is seen as a stage in this transition, right? And so many of these people were not opposed. And in fact, they did see that colonialism was as necessary. So Snæflid was a member of SDAP in the Netherlands, and he had some conflict with his colleague, with his comrades there, and then he left and moved to the Dutch East Indies. When he moved to the Dutch East Indies, he joined VSTP, the Vereniging van Spoor en Tramweg Personnel, which means the union for tram and train workers that is actually centralized in Semarang city in Central Java. It's very important to note from the beginning now that Semarang is a radical city, will soon to become a radical city. One, because it was where the headquarters of VSTP, but also, later on as the movement developed, it became the center of the Red movement. But going back to Snæflid, he joined VSTP and he was able to work up to the central management of VSTP and became the editorial staff of its journal called the Volharding, right? And also, he saw that SDAP is, of course, moderate and reformist. So he then invited some of his colleagues, to in Surabaya. There were 30 of them, and all of them were socialists, European socialists. But this in May 9th, May 9th, 1914, and they agreed to create a more, radical form of an organization called Indische Sociaal-Democratisch Vereniging, which means Indies Social Democratic Association, ISDV. Right, later on it became PKI, but we're still far away from there. So Snæflid was important in a way that he campaigned a more radical view, anti-colonial, right, view that was different from his SDAP colleagues, and he was able now to join VSTP. Also important to note that VSTP was among the very few trade unions in the Dutch East Indies that were open for natives. And who were among the leaders there? The Semaun, okay, which later became an Indonesian leader. How old was he? He was 15 when he started in VSTP. Amazing. A lot of Indonesians revolutionaries were very young at the time. So he recruited radicals from VSTP to join ISDV, including Semaun, right? Now we're gonna fast forward a little bit to 1917. Something great happened in the world, the Russian Revolution. Toppled the Tsar and then was able to replace it with the Bolshevik government. Again, same story with the Qing dynasty and Sun Yat-sen, but only in the Russian Revolution, it was the communists, who was able to topple the Tsar. So Snæflid then wrote an article titled Zegepraal, which means triumph, right? And he was arrested by it because, this article, it's it says, they're saying, hey, people in the colonies, look what those people in Russia was able to do. They were able to topple czar that have been there for centuries. You too could topple colonialism. Of course, he was he was arrested, right? And you know what? He defended himself in the court for 9 hours, defending himself. There was actually a whole, it was recorded. He defended himself, and sitting among the audience, many natives sitting there, right, listening to his defense. Sitting among them was Darsono, who immediately was converted into communism. He joined ISDV immediately after that. What happened to Snæflit? Snæflit got sent to in exile. He was sent out of the Dutch East Indies, and then he went back to Europe, and later he joined the Comintern. Maybe we'll talk about it later when we talk about the Comintern. So now Snæflit was gone. Baars, which is another Dutch ISDV leader, was very famous. He's actually the theoretician of ISDV. He was also later very quickly got sent out. So ISDV was quickly led by the Indonesian natives, the Indonesian activists such as Samaun and Darsono. Darsono has a Priai background actually. So if people ask, how did this red movement, they mobilized for the first time Kromo or lower class people, where were the Priai? There were Priai actually. Tan Malaka was a Priai class, educated class. Darsono was uneducated, but these were educated class who believe in the cause of the Kromo people. All right, so going back, 1918, Darsono, Samaun began to buy Sinar Jawa newspaper and turn it into Sinar Hindia, which then became the weapon. They like to call newspapers at the time a weapon of their movement, the Islamic Union, and Islamic Union of Semarang, which was the radical one, right? And so I mentioned before that in the early 1900s, there were a lot of journalists who then became activists. But in this time, it was the reverse. There were activists who became journalists, because they saw that the job of an activist as a propagandist could not be possible without publications, right? And also important at this time to remember that political parties are basically social organizations. This is Ruth McVeigh, right? It's social organizations, which means that you're not actually limited to membership or leadership only in one party. And this is why Samaun, Darsono, they led ISDV. Samaun also led VSTP, but also led the Islamic Union, SI, right? So because you can lead multiple organizations.
Oh, it's not much to add here, except that these people, the Snæflit and all of these early socialist democrats, is very, very clever in recruiting people at a very young age and train them, radicalize them. I think it's become an inspiration. Another thing to highlight was a lot of going on in the world, not only in the archipelago, in the Dutch East Indies, but also in the world during that time, that inspired people everywhere, not only in Asia, but also in, I think this is also in Latin America, especially in the Bahamas and also in the Philippines, and in India also. So I think this piece of history, we can talk a lot about the geopolitics at that time, the birth of the ideas at the time, how the inclusion of the common people to the political system, it started probably some decades before in other places, and then culminated in that between 1910 and 1920s. And the results we will see after that. And the Europe at that time also, the First World War, the big war over there, and it changed everything. That kind of, we have to consider that as a factor too. Yeah.
Can I add one more thing? Just I forgot to mention that it's so important that Sneevliet's contribution to the Dutch East Indies or to the history of Indonesia is that he was the first European who organized Indonesians to mobilize, because the previous Europeans that existed there with SDAP and all that, they did not believe in the cause of organizing Indonesians. They believed that Indonesians were not capable intellectually, economically, organizationally to pursue socialism, and so they were actually smirking at Ki Hajar Dewantoro, because they campaigned for direct independence. They're like, "What are you talking about? You are not capable of doing that," right? So Sneevliet was very important in starting that.
Just like us today with the Papuans, right?
Yes,
The history repeated itself.
history repeats itself.
Yes.
I want to pause to talk about how the Dutch are responding during the teens and early 20s with this real huge surge in popular organization and militancy and this newly assertive leadership layer. In 1918, they create the Volksraad or People's Council, which has some Indonesian representation on it. And it's this effort to involve locals in some way in government amid all the pressure they're under, though to be sure in a very tightly circumscribed sort of way. How overall are the Dutch responding to this emergence of modern Indonesian politics, some of it very radical? How, during these years of the ethical policy, are they balancing ameliorating reforms, attempting to placate the restive natives, with old-fashioned colonial direct coercion?
They regretted the ethical policy. They said, "Oh no, we shouldn't have done that." But so what we're seeing, the ethical policy was an opening for the natives by the teens, and especially the 20s, with the rise of the Red Movement, the Pergerakan Merah, the communist movement. They started to install the so-called the policing. They actually expanded their police force, and under the name, and this is very important because this is not just in the Dutch East Indies, under the name peace and order, rust and order, which means that they started to create laws or revise laws that used to be open up. They opened up rights for assembly and associations. Now they're tightening it up. And especially for the Red Movement, because they revolve around communication strategies. Made has mentioned, these people uses the strategies of vergadering or openbaar vergadering, public meetings in houses, in offices. They also did publications. They also created schools, and so the Dutch started to create laws and regulations around policing, surveilling, and limiting the right of association and assembly. This is just an example. Sometimes in 1920s, 22 or 23, after Semaun, Semaun was sent in exile because he led a big VSTP strike. The government came up with a law. First of all, they banned public meetings. But then after they opened it up, they created a law that people who join public meetings must be 18 years and older. Now, there was no ID card at the time for Native people. Most Native people, in fact, did not have birth certificate. They did not know how old they actually were, And then child labor was so prevalent at the time that many of these people, even look, Semaun started in VSTP when he was 15. So many people were actually already a labor at the time. And so joining this makes sense to them. Not just it's so important for them to join these meetings, right? But and then a lot of Indonesians were also small. So people, the Dutch police will just say, "Oh, you're still young. You're still too young." There is no proof, except for based on what they could see. So that's just one law. And then another law is around schools. The Wildesholland Ordinancy, which is the ordinance for wild schools, did not occur until much later in 1932. after the banning of communism. But we started to see again limiting law regulations limiting the deliverance and the holding of schools that were held by the Red Movement, where they created schools because native people did not have access. Only about 20% native by 1930? By 1930, only about 14 to 30% total of children in the Dutch East Indies that gained Dutch education. And in 1928, the literacy, Javanese literacy, is only 6%. So even though ethical policy brought schools, there were not really many people who gained schools. And also law around print and press, where they could confiscate technology and all that. So yeah, you're seeing under peace and order, tightening of laws around civil activities.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's the birth of police, the birth of intelligence. They need this kind of infrastructure in order to control people. Yeah, especially to control what people are reading. That's for one categories, as I mentioned, that's bacaan liar. That's what they call it, which is the wild literatures. And in order to counter the wild literatures, the government created a publishing company called Balai Pustaka. A lot of Indonesian educated writers, a lot of Indonesian writers also wrote a novel in there. So not, of course, not politics, but at that time it's always the big topics at that time. It's a clash between adat or customs in their own society with modernist idea, just like the forced marriage, which is rampant. So a lot of stories about that kind of things, in order to divert these educated people's attentions from the wild literatures, which is much talking about justice, or talking about the rights of the people, talking about movement and something like that, and then goes to Balai Pustaka. And then, strangely, the formal Indonesian history cited the Balai Pustaka as the birth of Indonesian literature, which is actually not. So they are equating themselves with the colonial government. This is the effort of the colonial government to curb the idea, to curb the radicalism, and then to curb the common people from accessing a different view of the social realities from the government.
We have a lot to talk about in terms of the PKI in the 1920s, but before we get there, we should talk about the organization and politics of Islam throughout this period. Made, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, new reformist currents of Islam entered Indonesia that posed a challenge to the so-called mystic synthesis model of Islam common across Java. And these currents, they were part of a global spread of Islamic modernism, which combined a more puritanical scripturalist theology on the one hand with, on the other hand, an emphasis on adopting science and technology of Western modernity. Meanwhile, Javanese traditionalists, led by religious teachers who were often also large landholders known as kiai, they pushed back to defend local forms of Islam. And at the same time, a fast-growing number of Javanese were becoming abangan, a term that refers to far less pious Muslims. These so-called abangan, in turn, were looked down upon by their more zealously religious neighbors, putahan, or santri. And I think casual Western observers tend to treat all forms of Islam as basically identical, which obviously listeners to this podcast know could not be further from the truth. So what were these new forms of Islam and new forms of less religious ways of being Muslim in Indonesian society? And how did they all reshape Indonesia? And how did the growing divide between the modernists and the traditionalists lead to the formation of two rival Muslim organizations, the modernist group Muhammadiyah, founded in 1912, and the traditionalist organization Nahdlatul Ulama, or NU, the so-called the Reawakening of Islamic Scholars. What sort of organizations were these, and what sort of social basis did they have, and what sort of political power did they exercise?
Yeah, I think first of all is in 1912 the birth of a Muhammadiyah, which is I think the roots of this is Islamic scholars, K. Ahmad Dahlan, went to Makkah, studied over there, and then got acquainted by a lot of Islamic scholars from Egypt, especially. So coming up with the idea of modern Islam. When you come back to Java, especially the birthplace of Muhammadiyah is in Yogyakarta. I think he's confronted by the ideas of the growing, the Javanese become Christian because the work of the missionary in here. So he looked at that, and then he have another, interpretation of Islam. So he want to create a missionary-like Muslim organizations, and that the birth of Muhammadiyah. So their work is especially on education and health. So they until now they have a lot of schools, thousands of schools, universities, and also hospitals and clinics all over, not only in Java but also all over Indonesia, because this is a modernist view of Islam. So they are very, very rich, a very big organization. I think a very the biggest organizations, modern Muslim organization in the world. But politically, they are not. They are, what do they say, that at some point they maintain independence from the government, but at the same time, at the other time, they cooperate with the government. So it's not a radical, but this is a really Islamic missionary organization. But the other hand, in 1926, there are another Islamic scholars which is based on more traditional, more Salafi in Islam. A traditional interpretation. They are studying what they call it the Yellow Book, the traditional books about the stories of the saints, and they maintain what they call it right now as a tradition, because in Muhammadiyah tradition, if you died, for example, you undergo the very simple burial. You died within a few hours, they will bury you. That's all, nothing. But in the traditional way, you have very complicated rituals. You will pray in the third day, the seventh day, and the 14th day, which Muhammadiyah deemed this is not the right Islam. That's what you call it. And this also, this Nahdlatul Ulama, they are unease with the Muhammadiyah movement, because it wants to modernize and simplifies a lot of Islamic traditions. So there are several qiyais or traditional Islamic teachers, some of them with thousands and thousands of followers, starting to congregate in East Java city of Jombang at that time. And then they create a new organization called Nahdlatul Ulama. So Nahdlatul Ulama is a vast network of pesantrens or traditional religious boarding schools. So the Kiai actually, this is a very special and also will relate to 65. Kiai is actually occupy a special place within Indonesian, within the Javanese society, because he's a teacher. So the original concept is that he's an expert on religion, so people will come to him and ask permission whether they come study under him, become his students. And as the pesantrens, the schools, they call it a pesantrian, it's come from santri, students or pupils. And these pupils coming to the kiai, and the kiai will teach them during the evening and early in the morning. And during the day, they will work for the kiai in kiai's rice fields, for example. Kiai is usually, because he's a leader in a village, is a very rich. He has, I think, the biggest and the best land in the village. So the santris would work in there and live in the boarding schools, or autonomously, and then cook for themselves and taking care of themselves. But they refer the kiai. The santri will move if the kiai say that, well, you have enough education, they will move to another kiai, which has a different specialty of knowledge of Islam. So these vast networks, right now, it becomes Nahdlatul Ulama. It's claimed in itself as the biggest Islamic organization, which is probably true because it has a lot of because there's a lot of center. But inside, unlike Muhammadiyah, which is organized like a modern organization, the Nahdlatul Ulama is a kind of a network. So a lot of kiais with their own influence. Not every kiai has the similar influence. Some kiai is really big, revered by hundreds of thousands of people, but some of the small kiais only a dozen of followers in kampung, something like that. So there's also lineage of the very powerful pesantren. If you're coming out like the President Abdurrahman Wahid, the Indonesia's third president, he's the fourth president, I think. He come from the very influential pesantren family, Kiai in Jombang. Is the birthplace of Nahdlatul Ulama. So he's revered as almost half saint with lots of followers. And that's why I also explain why the Nahdlatul Ulama, even until now, it's really hard to get them into union with each other because there's always competition and conflicts inside the organizations. Abangan is a different thing. Abangan is what you call it, nominal Muslims. Yeah, they are not all, they are practicing Muslims, probably for some part of their life, but they don't pray 5 times a day. They don't fast. They don't really give an alms, something as sadaqah, infaq, or paying their religious tax, which is zakat. They are outside of the Islam, but they are still consider themselves as Islam. But at the other time, they're practicing some part of Hinduism, Buddhism, and then they basically don't really care about religion. That's the majority of the people in Java before the Islamization during the New Order.
Though political Islam and communism would ultimately become lethally opposed to one another in Indonesia, at this time, some, like SI leader Haji Muhammad Misbah, advocated for their combination. How did Islamic and socialist and communist politics interact throughout this period?
Mada said that this is an important time, an exciting time, because we are able to say the word Islam and communism in one breath. Before that, we don't have that. But let me refer back to our previous conversation about the distinction between Abangan and versus Santri, and then modernist versus traditionalist. At this time, there is also another distinction, and in fact, this is a distinction that was used by the colonial government, which is the so-called political Islam versus non-political Islam. And this distinction it actually came up was invented by Snoek Horgrogne, who is a Dutch scholar, who is also an advisor on native affairs to the colonial government. It is very important for the colonial government to be able to separate between Islam that is political, that is a threat to the colonial government, and those Islam that are just, they're doing their own business, right? So oftentimes, the Muslim communists, and when I say Muslim communists, these are communists who are also Muslim. And then you mentioned Haji Misbah was one of them. And oftentimes they are being put under the same label. Now, during the Red Movement, there were actually different interpretation of Islam. And unfortunately, by putting it under the same umbrella of political Islam, it's obscured us from seeing not just the contribution this debate had, but also how rich their debate was. And I'm going to just give you an example of the debates between the group that I will call the Islamic Socialism group versus the Communism Islamism group. Now, the Islamic Socialism group was interpretation of Islam that was produced by the leader Cokro Aminoto that we have discussed before, right? So Cokro Aminoto, for example, in his book called Islam and Socialism, basically he said that, or he believed, and this is what he wrote in his book, that socialism is inherent within Islam, that Muslims should only follow socialism that is based on Islamic teachings. Islam is already socialist. We no longer bring in the socialism from those Europeans that were essentially are non-Muslims anyway, right? So we don't want to have those influences of the Europeans. So he basically come up with this idea of Islamic socialism. In the meantime, the communists such as Haji Misbah, Tan Malaka, Semaun, or even the Tawalib school. It's actually a modernist school in Sumatra. Datu Batua and Jamaluddin Tamim are some of the teachers there. They came up with this synthesis between communism and Islamism. And they continue to show the compatibility between Islamism and communism and how they are needed for each other. And in 1922, after Tan Malaka got banished from the Indies, he joined the Comintern Fourth Congress, and he actually challenged Lenin, because Lenin said, our proletariat revolution should not include this pan-Islamism, because they fought for the Muhammadan, right? But Tan Malaka said, wait, we can't do that. You are eliminating a majority of people in the South who are in fact proletariat, workers, laborers, peasants, and they're also Muslims, right? And so one of the contribution, I think, of the synthesis between Islamism and communism is Tan Malaka's idea of Islam, in that it's very much not thinking about Muslim only in terms of this metaphysic, Islamic jurisprudence or metaphysics, but also from historical materialism lens. What he said is that there is no way we can understand Muslims' livelihood without understanding their lived experiences under capitalism, under colonialism. So to create Islamic subjectivity, we need to understand the suffering of Muslim experience as laborers and as proletariats. This is like an amazing contribution, but by putting it just under political Islam and just, under something that is unimportant, I think we are missing what actually could have developed our practices of Islam even more. Because of that, also because of this tension, you can already feel the tension, right? Because of this tension, Islamic Union of Cokro Aminoto began the campaign of the so-called party discipline. Party disciplines mean the disciplining of the party to move away, to purify the Islamic Union from this infiltration of the communists and socialists, right? And then to split it. Of course, there was also other issues going on at the time because essentially Cokro also was accused of embezzling the Islamic Union money. And so a lot of people use the term mencokro, which means to cokro. To cokro means to embezzle money at the time. Sometimes it's used that way. So remember, Cokro was seen as the just king, and now suddenly these communists were writing in the newspaper and accusing him of embezzling money, right? So he was treated in a profane way instead of a sacred way. And so it reinforced even more the party discipline. And eventually in 1922, there was a split between the Islamic Union, the Red Islamic Union versus the White Islamic Union. The White Islamic Union died down. Nobody joined. Most majority of the Kromo people joined the Red Islamic Union, and that the name of Red Islamic Union later changed into the People's Union. Isn't it amazing? Changing it from Islam into people, because they said, we are not an organization that only fought for the interest of the Muslims. We are fighting for everybody, regardless of their ethnicities, nations, religions, and languages. So this is an amazing, the meeting between Islamism and communism produced such a democratic, egalitarian, and emancipatory ideas, in my view, in this period.
Yeah, this is interesting to see the trajectory of the Sarekat Islam, which is started from as mentioned before. I think about this started as a business union, Sarekat Dagang Islam, and then after that it's become Sarekat Islam, and that is divided into two, the white and the red, and then I think by the time that it becomes radicalized, the business people are gone. They are not. They're not, because this involved the commoners, the mass base. They are not comfortable with that, and then they are gone. And then after that, after the organizations split again, the white was just wither, and then the red is evolved into the People's Union. I think this kind of things. This is such a big organization at that time, and then very influential. I think the amazing things that what this Sarekat or this union did was that it organized a lot of people which never thought before that they have rights. They are human beings. So there's this kind of things. I think this enlightenment brings about a real mass-based organization. It's incredible in my view in this part. It's very different from other organizations, even though different from Muhammadiyah, which is started from the elite to produce the elites with the education and the health of movement.
Anna, as we discussed, Dutch socialist Henk Sneevliet brought communism to Indonesia, founding the Indies Social Democratic Association, or ISDV, in 1914. How did the ISDV become the Communist Union of the Indies, and then, in 1924, the Communist Party of Indonesia, or PKI, and how, given that at this point Sneevliet, Samaun, and Tan Malaka, they were all in exile, how did the PKI, the first communist party founded in Asia, how did it grow in size, organization, militancy in the way that it did throughout the 1920s, not just as a party, but as a broader red movement?
Yeah, excellent question. The ISDV became formally PKH, Partai Komunis Hindia, or the Communist Party of the Indies, on May 23rd, 1920. And then later the name changed into the Communist Party of Indonesia. And so at the beginning, there were these native people. After Sneevliet left, right? The native people, Samaun, and then Tan Malaka returned from his education in the Netherlands back to the Indies and started to build people's schools, for example. And then in 1921, 1922, 1923, these leaders became in exile, like what Dan has explained before. So what happened then after 1923? Now, this is a gap because the existing scholarship, before my book, they actually stopped up until 1923 and said no, not up until 1923 and said that these leaders were already in exile. But by tracing their newspapers, I found that in fact, especially Sinar Hindia newspapers with reports of public meetings that were held almost every day, not just in like big hall, or big rooms, but rather in houses, where they, these peasants, after they work in the plantation, they held meetings in their houses. And that actually then, created a very organic and grassroots mobilizing strategies around communication techniques to mobilize the movement. So to answer your question, after most of the male leaders left, the commoners, the Kromo people, they organized themselves through the production of communication strategies. Amongst them, most important were public meetings or the openbaar vergaderingen. And we started to see names that we never saw before, which involve women, which involve children, Chinese name, Indian names, European names were involved in this movement. And then there were also publications, translations. We have Woro Ati and Woro Juina was, Miss Juina was an important and the first editor of the Sinar Hindia newspaper, for example. And then for public meetings, we have Miss Munasia, who would go from series to series as propagandist at the time. The word propaganda at the time did not have a bad meaning yet. And then people's schools were also mobilizing to sincerely actually educate native children, and that was started by Tan Malaka before he went in exile. And then outside of this public meetings and schools, we also have messengers, which means, remember the leaders are abroad. So we had sailors who work for the different companies, not the Dutch companies, who would smuggle letters, publications from the leaders in Europe. And it's so interesting. Sometimes so Samaun would translate, writings by Lenin, but he would translate it, and then the title would be some romantic title, like Unrequited Love or something, but actually inside it is a Lenin's translation, the translation of Lenin's work. So this was a burgeoning, very exciting moment seemingly without leaders, but actually their leaders were the Kromo people, and involved children, people of different ethnicities, and women, and just regular rank and file men who led the movement and mobilized the movement in their homes, opening their homes for public kitchen, for example. And the women would just cook together and started talking about communism,
Yeah, just a quick thing. So, hearing Anna's descriptions, I think we can think is how valuable ideas are during that time, how we transferred the transfer of ideas from other places from Europe to India, for example, or probably to somewhere else. It's not like right now we have ideas just instantly. We are flooded with ideas. At that time, it becomes very, very valuable. Not only because of who wrote that idea, but the idea itself. It's you have to hide it behind a romance books. That's amazing.
Yeah, I forgot to add also that this time it's not just innovative in terms of its communication strategies, right? Which actually I the vibe of the period is I call it the Red Enlightenment, because it was it was not about violence. They actually did not want to use violence. It was about organizing. It was about writing as weapons, But also importantly, this is during this peak time, again, leaderless, 1923 to 1925, the movement spread out. It spread out to Sumatra with Sumatra Tawalip, in West Sumatra, led by Datuk Batua. In East Timor, we have Christian Pandi who led it. and then among Dayak people in Borneo, and then also in Sulawesi and Maluku. So the movement become, when you talk about Indonesia as an archipelago, this movement started to reflect more of a more united anti-colonial struggle against the Dutch that is revolutionary. Then, of course, we have sailors who got sent to Kutv, which is the University of the Toilers of the East in Russia. So what I mean is that this movement is also very global, right? And was supported also by non-communists. The Sinpo newspaper, which is a dominant Chinese newspaper, supported this movement, and also older activists. So it was such an exciting moment that we have. Obviously, later, of course, we will see that communism would be killed 3 times and still now dead. I'm not dead, but banned until today. But this is just an exciting moment, full of optimism, with a spirit of democracy and solidarity. That was amazing to see, that we never saw before in previous centuries.
Speaking of the internationalism of this moment, as we've discussed, many socialist and communist leaders were jailed or expelled, and this expulsion was an experience that sent Sneevliet, Samoon, and Tan Malaka into these remarkable lives, crisscrossing the world, taking up different roles in the global communist movement. What sort of global revolutionary work did these Indonesian exiles take on? And then more generally, how did Indonesian communism relate to the larger politics of global communism? And how did global communism in turn, including the Comintern, how did it relate to the PKI?
Right. So one of the important contributions actually that was discussed in the Comintern congresses, is that the Indonesian communists contributed this concept of the bloc within. Remember, just some minutes ago we discussed how many of the Indonesian revolutionaries, they also organized different parties. So when Samaun joined ISDV, he was a VSTP trade unionist, right? But when he joined ISDV, he also joined Islamic Union. We go back now to 1918s. And what he did was we call it sometimes they call it infiltration, but actually really he went up to the rank of leadership in Islamic Union, that he then changed the agenda of Islamic Union. And the bloc within was such an important concept that when Sneevliet got sent in exile from the Indies, he then joined the Congress in Comintern, the second Congress in 1920 in Russia. And then he was actually he was sent by the Comintern as a Comintern official to China to apply exactly the bloc within, to infiltrate or to apply the bloc within in KMT, Kuomintang, and then turn that nationalist party into communist party. Right? So that's one way. And then Tan Malaka, of course, he would also be sent to China and then later to Southeast Asia, but then he would also split from the Comintern after the death of Lenin, and its turn, Comintern itself also split, right? And then turned into Stalinism. But Tan Malaka was also an official for Comintern, and then also Samaun, when he got sent in exile, he became a representative for Indonesian communism based in the Netherlands, but a part of the Communist Party of the Netherlands, CPN. Then we have also other people later on, Rustam Effendi, who actually he fled after the banning of communism following the revolt in 1926-27. He fled and he then worked for CPN, and actually the first Indonesian parliamentary that represents CPN in the Netherlands. But on the other hand, also, how did global communism relate to the PKI? This is what's actually really interesting, because materially, the Comintern did not put so much investment in Indonesia compared to China. They did put a lot of investment in China compared to Indonesia. So what we are seeing, although obviously in Indonesia, in the Dutch East Indies, people continue to read translation of Lenin's work, and also Comintern leaders, Karl Radek and those people, right? But actually, though in my view, because of the lack of material support from the Comintern, and also the whole gap, right? Because with not having leaders in the Indies, the movement in Indonesia, the communist movement, was very much organic in its development and very much grassroots in its own interpretation of communism. So the most important contribution are two things, I think, in relation to Comintern. One is the push against a push for supporting pan-Islamism, but also push for anti-colonial agenda. Like putting anti-colonial agenda at the center of our fight against capitalism and for communism, and also as an imagination of not just a nation liberated for colonialism, but also worldwide liberation from capitalism.
Anna, let's talk about that uprising that you just mentioned. In 1926, the PKI launched this revolt against Dutch rule that was brutally crushed, and the ensuing repression drove the party deep underground. Why did the PKI launch that uprising when they did, and what did it look like as it unfolded? And then lastly, what were the consequences of the PKI's repression for the remaining decade and a half of Dutch colonial rule?
So to understand the uprising, it's very important that we understand anti-communist campaigns that also began very early as the movement was flourishing. So persecution was rampant even with the earlier generation, like Mas Marco, Haji Misbah, that actually did not, he was a second generation, a first generation, right, of the pergerakan, not even the communist movement, but even they were experiencing jailing. And so if you join the Red Movement in 1920s and you became an editor or journalist for these newspapers, you would be likely experience some jailing. It's a given. Or if you were a main leader like Tan Malaka, Semaun, Darsono, or Musso, you would then be sent in exile, right? But again, like I said, between 1923 to 1925, without the existence of these main leaders, the movement were thriving. Also, the anti-communist campaign. What's famous among them, for example, this anti-communist campaign of Sarekat Hijau, the Green Union. They would throw rocks on people's houses when they had meeting. They would burn houses. They would come into somebody's house and then took books, Or there were also obviously the police, the Dutch police, who would do the same, right? So they created this disturbances among the otherwise very much civil meetings among the communists. And so at the beginning of 1926, we barely see any more meetings because people were afraid. Ordinary people who used to go to meetings, they sing, they dance, they talk about. They don't just talk about anti-colonial struggle, by the way. They would connect fixing this bridge and women's right with anti-colonial struggle, right? But so this was like celebratory, and they stopped doing that because they were so afraid of this anti-communist horizontal, reactions by the people. So we're no longer seeing any movement. So because of this heightened anti-communist campaign that people experience both vertically and horizontally, a few communist leaders actually on December the 25th, 1925, they gathered in Prambanan and they agreed to do a revolt, right? They actually agreed to do it sometime in June or July, but actually it didn't happen until November 26 in Java, and only in two locations, in Batavia and Banten, and then in Silungkang, West Sumatra, later in December, at the end of December to New Year's in 1927. But they were quickly quelled, this revolt. And even though it was very localized, the revolt was not supported by the majority of the people. As I said, the majority of people stayed home. They did not even know about this revolt. They no longer, Sinar Hindia newspaper were already closed at this time, right? But the government brutally crushed the rebellion. They arrested about 13,000 people, 4,000 something people were imprisoned, and some, close to 1,000 people were exiled to the notorious Bovendigul. This Bovendigul camp is actually a concentration camp. Rudolf Mrazek just recently released a book about it in Papua. It's a malaria-ridden Digul. So if it's you would die basically just by virtue of being there. In fact, Haji Misbah and many other died because of sickness there. And PKI was banned, was outlawed. And then what happened after that? Now, traditional periodization would stop the history of PKI here, right? Because it's banned. But actually, many of those communists who were able to do that, either they undercover become sailors, or they also have money, so they ran away to Mecca, to the Middle East, or they fled. They would escape to Southeast Asia, like Singapore, to run away from possible arrest. And also during this time, Tan Malaka split from the Komintern and created his own party called PARI. And so what we're seeing now is from 1927 all the way to the 1930s is a period of policing, surveillance, and repression of anything that's considered radical. There were intergovernment cooperation of surveillance and policing, for example, during this time, where the French, the British, and the Dutch, they worked together and they exchange surveillance information, and so eventually they were able to catch some of the revolutionaries that already fled, such as Jamaluddin Tamin, Subakat. They were eventually and the returning sailors who went to school in Russia. They were also arrested. But however, there were also exiles, right, that stay in Europe or somewhere, like Tan Malaka stayed in China for a while. They later came back during the Japanese occupation after the Dutch was kicked out by the Japanese. So we have, Tan Malaka, Musso, Semaun, Rustam Effendi, who later came back and later would revive PKI during this time, especially during the National Revolution.
Yeah, I think for the rebellion, I think it's aborted rebellion without much preparations, without good organizations. I don't know. We are really, as Indonesian, we are really bad in studying history, because this is also in 65. That's also, or in 48. I think we repeated it again. This kind of things, this kind of rebellion in 65, even though there's a little indication of the Communist Party involvement as a party, but probably at the top level they are, planning something. But it's again, it's very early, unorganized, and without careful planning to take over the power. And this is more, I think I agree with the great Indonesian historian Sartono Kartodirjo, that this is more like Just King movement, millennialism for the people, for the mass people, because there's no leadership. At that time, all of the leaders are being exiled, and they have to decide it by themselves. There's not so strong tools for organizing. But amazingly, I think, may I go back to the futures a little bit. I think last year, I found out the remnants of this in Prambanan, because I live, Yogyakarta is very close to Prambanan. There's several villages in Prambanan who still have that kind of spirit. Like of their predecessors in 1926, they reclaim land from the former Dutch plantations, and they had fight with government even during the New Order. And right now, that land has belonged to the people. And what's very, very interesting is that there's no private ownerships. They create a husbandry, collective husbandry, which probably in one collective, they probably have 50 cows over there. So they raise cows and they raise goats collectively. So I was amazed that, well, this kind of still preserved and alive at the village level, and the government tried to do whatever they could to disperse this kind of things, to erase this kind of memories, but it's it's still alive until now. That's amazing for me at the grassroots level, how much the idea of the party of the communism is still alive, even though people are not talking about that, about communists or communism anymore, but in practice they are doing it.
I'm Master Taylor, and you're listening to The Dig with Daniel Denver, a podcast for people who want to deeply understand the world and organize to change it. That's why you should support the show at patreon.com/thedig.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Pluto Press, the independent radical publisher. One new book from Pluto you might like is Rising for Palestine, Africans in Solidarity for Decolonization and Liberation, edited by Raouf Farah and Soraya Dadu. Championed by Francesca Albanese as a wake-up call for Africa, this collection brings writers from Africa and Palestine together in a project of solidarity against colonialism, apartheid, and empire, urging the continent to not fall into the trap of the ultra-liberal ideologies that have enabled the annihilation of Palestine. Dig listeners can get 50% off their first order of this or any book from Pluto Press using the code DIG50 at plutobooks.com. That's DIG50 at plutobooks.com. Okay, I want to pause to say we're now being joined by a third guest, Farabi Fakih, who goes by Abi. Abi, welcome to The Dig.
Thanks, Dan. I'm glad to be here.
There are three key currents in the Indonesian anti-colonial movement: the communists, the Islamists, and then a very important group that we haven't covered yet, the nationalists. In 1927, amid this intense repression of the PKI following the 1926 uprising, Sukarno led the formation of the Indonesian Nationalist Party, or PNI, the party that would lead the struggle for independence, and that, under Sukarno's rule, would be the leading force in Indonesian politics. Indeed, the PNI's successor party, the PDIP, it remains a major force in Indonesian politics today, as we'll discuss in the final episode of this series. Who was Sukarno? What was his idea to synthesize Islam, Marxism, nationalism? Why did he have such incredible popular appeal? And how, under his leadership, was the PNI established?
So Sukarno was born in 1901. He is the son of a Javanese teacher in the government school system and his Balinese wife. And he went to school in Surabaya. And when he was in Surabaya, he actually was boarded with a friend of his father, who we all know, named Cokro Aminoto. And he came of age in 1920s during the heyday of the Pergerakan Merah, of the Red Movement. So he quickly became and learned. He was actually very timid at first, but then he quickly learned from his later father-in-law, actually. Cokro Aminoto became his father-in-law. He became a charismatic orator. As a reminder, we discussed how Cokro Aminoto was this firebrand, leader with an exquisite oratorial skill that was able to move people with his charisma, right? And hence he was also seen as a just king. So Sukarno modeled after him. But another skill that Sukarno had was that he is like a weaver. He was a master of a political synthesis. And so in Chokro's house, he met and debated with many pergerakan leaders at the time. So, and he read widely. He wrote in the Sarekat Islam or Islamic Union newspaper, Utusan Hindia, and he spoke at in Islamic Union meetings. Although I it's not clear to me if he was actually a mobilizer under the Red Movement, but he was politically active under the Islamic Union. And then he moved to Bandung to pursue a technical college in 1921. And there he actually met with other pergerakan leaders, including the Tiga Serangkai, the Three Clover leaders that we discussed as well, Cipto, Dowes Dekker, and Ki Hajar Dewantara, who founded Indonesia Party. As a reminder, these three leaders were sent in exile because their party was the first party to campaign for Indonesian independence, but on a nationalist term. So not on an Islamic, Marxist, or any narrowly ethnic categories like Budi Utomo with Javanese, for example. So Sukarno gained his inspiration and justification of a form of nationalism from these three people, that was devoid of any Islamic or religious commitment and theory of class struggle or any formal link to ethnic group, right? So when he created the idea of Islam, Marxism, and nationalism after the banning and the repression of the Red Movement, he wanted to basically say that Islamists, the Marxists, and secular nationalists were actually, all of us were anti-imperialist, and we all opposed the Dutch occupation. And instead of fighting with each other, we should instead unite. That's his idea of Nasakom. And so when he created PNI, the Indonesian Nationalist Party, just a few months after the suppression of communism, right? The last one was in January. The last revolt in Sumatra was in January 1927. So in July 1927, he founded the Indonesian Nationalist Party that was nationalist and anti-colonial above all, and rejected cooperation with the Dutch, demanding full independence for Indonesian liberation, basically.
So maybe just to sort of add with what Anna has extensively discussed. So yes, Sukarno comes from a minor priai, and so he has Western privileges, right? As Anna has mentioned, he was educated at the technical college level, and so he was part of that generation of priai influenced by nationalist ideas. What's really interesting in connection to this is that in comparison to other leaders like Hatta or Shahrir, is that Sukarno never went abroad. He never studied in the Netherlands or anywhere else. And he never really went abroad before the 50s when he became president. So his views in a way are shaped purely from a colonial lens. And thus in a way is also an idealized version of colonialism and imperialism and anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism. Shahrir, for instance, had a Dutch wife. Hatta had been living in the Netherlands for a long time. But the idea of Nasakom, nationalism, Islam, and communism, it was his core tenet. And it's really perhaps an indication of his Javanese syncretism, because he was able to sort of syncretize these various different ideologies and movements. And it was the guiding principle of his belief system. But why this was possible was because all of them share the basic notion of deep anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism, as Anna has mentioned. This is the core idea, is that they all are different sides of the same sort of coin, and that this guiding principle is what leads to his belief in his ideology of what was called Marhainism, which was a Marxism with Indonesian characteristics. So I think at its core is Marxist analysis that sort of cuts through all of the various. So Indonesian nationalism, Indonesian Islam, and Indonesian communism all grew out of this very basic Marxist analysis that criticized imperialism. That is what sort of the basic foundation of Indonesian nationalism in Sukarno's point of view.
Yeah, I think this is a very unique characteristic in the history of the world, and also Sukarno has blend everything. Yeah, like Abby said, as a syncretism, as a Japanese, as a Muslims, and also as a probably also interested in the socialist idea, but he has come up with he knows exactly his society. He cannot go radical on all of these things. So instead of he just pick a bit here and there and blend it into Indonesian nationalism. In the term of nationalism, if you ask people what is the Indonesian nationalism, this is really you cannot find a clear answer because he founded the ideology of the state, the Pancasila, the five principles. It's also a blend of so many things and makes it also unclear on so many levels. But it works. At least until now, it works. This is a very, very unique characters, I guess, and nobody has the ability to blend together everything and then cook it and then provide it and mold it into one nation. Whether it is successfully what bring progress and prosperity to the nation, that's another problem. But at least on the level of thinking, I think Sukarno has done very great things to Indonesia.
Abe, who were those other key figures at the lead of the nationalist movement that you just mentioned, Hatta and Shahrir? How did their approach and ideology differ from Sukarno's? What, in general, do we need to understand about this broader array of nationalist politics within which Sukarno is in the lead, but by no means the only leader or contender for power?
In general, you can divide Indonesian leadership into two. One would be what would call the solidarity maker, and the other are the managerialist. The solidarity maker are those who are able to sway the masses, right? And that's necessary for Indonesian nationalism. Sukarno is at the head, at the peak of that populist appeal. He represents the masses. So, and his ideologies represent this sort of populist national stream. At the other side of it are what would be called the managerialist. So Hatta and Shahrir are part of the other group. So these people are less focused on the masses. So they would be focused more on cadres, on developing intellectual managerial groups and so forth, technocrats and so forth. And it's really also, Sukarno is Javanese, whereas Hatta and Shahrir is from Sumatra, from the West Sumatra. And so they don't have a mass appeal as Sukarno does, because among the Javanese, Sukarno is very popular. Till today, like the PDIP's core bases are in Java, in East Java, in Bali, where he came from. So, and this actually appeared later in the 30s. If you compare Sukarno's PNI and Hatta's PNI Baru, in which it's much more focused on developing professional cadres, intellectuals, whereas Sukarno is more, how do you get the masses, how do you appeal to the masses? So I guess in a sense, they're two sides of the same coin. They're not really, they need each other, although that became problematic in the 50s. But during this period, they both sort of play a different role within the broader nationalist movement, but differently, yeah. But I have to say, though, Sukarno really became much more popular during the Japanese occupation afterwards.
Yeah, Hatta and Shahrir both are educated in the Netherlands. I think they are from Minangkabau, is West Sumatra, and then Hatta is an economist by training, very technocratic. If you want to use the language of the current era, and also like Abby said, is a type administrator's type. He didn't talk like Sukarno, who can attract. He's not charismatic, actually, very calm, and also Shahriar. I think is more of a thinker when he wrote the pamphlet, Demokrasi Kita, Our Democracy. That's become a foundation, I think, for the so many, very popular among Indonesian intellectuals until recent days. It laid a foundation about the democracy in Indonesia. It's very strange, actually, in the 46. There's an Indonesian politician already talking about democracy. There's a system which is, I think at the time, it's still very strange. Although a few years later, we have elections. I think the free election in 1955. But even that, one Indonesian politician or one Indonesian thinker started thinking about that in the early age of the republic. I think it give the legacy, if you like or not, but democracy is still thriving in Indonesia right now, until now, at least in the form of the election. Whether it's free or not, that's not the problem. The problem that we still have get the legitimacy from the elections. That's the most important thing of the contribution of Sharia, I think. And Hatta, as an economist, I think contribute on the people's economy in front of our cooperatives. He's known as the father of Indonesian cooperatives movement.
Really remarkably, the Sarekat Islam, the Islamic Union leader, Jokro Aminoto, who we've discussed a few times, he and his wife had this astonishingly wide range of future Indonesian leaders board with them as young boys. The communists, Semaun, Alamin, and Musso, and then Kartosuwiryo, this radical Islamist leader of a guerrilla force later on called Darul Islam that we'll discuss in later episodes. And of course, none other than Sukarno himself. What does the fact that all of these boys passed through the same house tell us about this very particular social layer that emerged in a very particular way at a very particular moment that ended up going on to populate the upper ranks of the anti-colonial Indonesian leadership? Very different currents of that leadership as well.
Yeah, I think the fact that Semaun, Alimin, Musso, Kartosuwiryo, and Sukarno all passed through the household of Cokro Aminoto, first of all, it made me think, it must be a nice house. How big is the house? But putting that aside, it also tells us something very precise about the social composition of the early anti-colonial leadership. That it was small, it was educated and mobile, right? And then it's also politically experimental, right? And another thing that's really important that also tied us to the ethical policy is that they were all product of the Dutch colonial educational system. So this anti-colonial leadership, right, was not led by village ulama or religious leaders, plantation coolies or rural peasants or even the aristocracy, right? But instead, these were, lesser priai, educated leaders that somehow they gained the education, but they weren't fully integrated into the colonial privilege. They weren't given the power of sovereignty and etc. Right? So in a sense, the house, I imagine, functioned almost like political seminary with all of the ideological range of, from communism, like you mentioned, Semaun Alimin Musso, and then the radical Islamist revolutionary like Kartosuwiryo, and then the nationalist synthesizer like Sukarno. So what we are seeing here is that before the ideological splits that we see in late 1920s, the line between Islam, socialism, and nationalism were actually very fluid. So that's one. And then they differed in solutions. One is for the Islamic states, another one is for communist revolution, the other one is for national unity, right? But they all actually shared a common structural problem, right? The question is, how can we seize sovereignty in a very repressive and racially hierarchical colonial order? And this conflicts and these experiments we see throughout, even later on in the 30s and the 40s, right? It continues to be a conversation. So Cokro's house is actually served more like a microcosm of the early 20th century Indonesian political society, where we see all of these debates continue to emerge between these three groups.
One of the particular things that we have to remember that these people are all Javanese people who are staying at Cokro Aminoto's house. There are two streams. I think has a very strong followers among the Javanese, which is the biggest ethnic group in Indonesia. Was that from there are three. You have Syarikat Islam coming out from this, and also the nationalist movement and the communist movement. But other streams, I think, also we often forget that Indonesia also in debt to the people of Minangkabau who sent their children, especially the upper class of the Minang upper class, either to Jakarta to study at the law schools, also study at the medical schools, and also they sent it directly to the Netherlands. So people like Shahrir, people like Hatta, and also don't forget people like Yamin. Actually, a lot of people, they are also in there. It's a very different stream of thinking. There's also a very strong communist in West Sumatra also, different stream from what developed in Java. People like Tan Malaka, for example, has a very, very different view of what communism compared to Javanese communists, which is later on, I think Abby can talk probably a little bit about in the 50s, how these two streams collide, and then a lot of communists from outside Java stopped being communist, and then the Javanization of the Communist Party, that's in the 50s. They're probably too simple to say that, but that's what's in general it looks like.
And just to clarify for listeners, the Minangkabau are a group from West Sumatra.
Yeah, I think I agree with what the other speakers have said, especially Made's separation between Javanese and Sumatran nationalist leaders. Java has had a much longer period of colonialism and colonial capitalism, and Javanese identity is very much class-based because the vast majority of Javanese were indentured in some way laboring class. So even though the Javanese Priai or lesser Priai class are middle class or above they are still part of a much more stronger class-based identity. That's why communism was so much more appealing in Java than outside of Java to a large extent. Whereas the ones from Sumatra are what you would call as petit bourgeois. So a lot of the Minangkabau leaderships, they didn't come from bureaucratic roots, but they came from trading roots, because there's a stronger traditional capital class in Sumatra, whereas in Java it has been decimated by either Chinese capitalism or Dutch capitalism. And so that's why Sukarno could envision Nasakom in a way that Sumatrans couldn't, because in a way all of the Javanese nationalists, whether communist or Islamist or nationalist, they came within a class perspective. And so they came within this notion of class independence or class, whereas the Sumatrans would have a different take on it. So there's a stronger, there's a different kind of Islamist notion because of the stronger capitalist, traditional capitalist class in the outer island in general, I think. So maybe just to add on the complexity there.
How did the final decade of Dutch colonial rule play out for the nationalists? In 1931, Sukarno's PNI was actively repressed and dissolved. Parthindo, which means Indonesian Party, and also the Indonesian Nationalist Education, a party called New PNI, were both founded to take up the mantle of nationalist anti-colonial politics in the wake of the PNI's repression. A lot's going on here. What sort of trajectory were anti-colonial politics more generally, and nationalist politics in particular, on throughout the 1930s, this very harshly repressive decade leading up to Hitler's 1940 invasion of the Netherlands and Japan's 1942 invasion of Indonesia?
So as you said, this is a very repressive time in Indonesian politics, in colonial politics in Indonesia, initially under Foch, and then later on. So all the shift was really a realization amongst the colonial leadership that the ethical policy failed. This, of course, occurred after 26. This was the major tipping point. The communist rebellion sort of shifted. But also in general, colonial society was becoming more right-wing. So there emerged parties like the Vaderlandse Club, and then the Nazi Party of the Indies, the NSB, National Socialist Beweging, and the older like capitalist lobbying parties like the PEB, the Colonial Capital Lobby Party in the Volksraad.
And just to pause you to clarify there, to emphasize, this is the Dutch colonialists in the
Indies, yes.
In the Dutch Indies are taking a hard turn towards fascism during this period.
Yes. So there's an emerging fascist undercurrent within amongst the Indos. So the EFA, the Eurasian Bond, but also the purely Dutch population in the Indies were becoming much more right wing. Now, amongst the nationalists, they're split two groups: the moderates and the radicals, the colonials would call it. But usually it's termed as the cooperatists, those who cooperate with the colonial state, and the non-cooperatists. So the PNI Baru, the Partindo, these are the non-cooperatists. So these are from the lineages of Sukarno, Hatta, and so forth. So these would be termed radical nationalists by the Dutch. And among the non-cooperative parties, so the Partindo is from the Sukarno's PNI, and so it's more mass appealing, whereas the PNI Baru from Hatta and Shahrir is more intellectual, is more professional focused, cadre forming, and so you can see like the PNI Baru as leading up to the PSI later on, which is a socialist party, but it's also a highly intellectual party, and which would birth a lot of the Indonesian technocrats later on in the 50s. And then the other equation are the moderates, those that still remain in the colonial parliament, in the Volksraad. And these would be formed by two large parties. One is the Parindra, who is right wing, and the other one is the Gerindo, who is left wing. The Parindra is quite interesting. They're not a fascist party, but they have a lot of fascist aesthetics. So they've also sort of, became influenced by the shift towards the right in colonial society. And so they would have some semblance of fascism. They cannot be called fascism because they're anti-colonial and anti-imperial, but because they're a right-wing party, they have these kind of fascist imagery. The Gerindo is more of a leftist party. It's actually Gerindo is so Partindo was eventually outlawed by the Dutch in the middle 30s, and some parts of the Partindo party, which was the Sukarno's PNI party, they became moderate. So they think that the only way to push forth the agenda was through parliament, and so they became a normal party, a normal moderate party with elections and so forth. So that represents the left-wing part of the nationalist movement. So, but in general, nothing big happens in the 30s because there was so much repression that these things were happening, but it really only blossomed after the collapse of colonial state in 42.
I want to ask a few follow-up questions. In 1935, as you were just referring to, the Indonesian aristocratic elite led by the founder of Bodayatomo, a figure named Sotomo, who we've discussed earlier. He created this great Indonesian party, Perindra, which was, as you said, a conservative, a right-wing party, and it sought out I think, a path to more gradual independence in cooperation with the Dutch rather than in rebellion against them. And you were laying out how they were simultaneously attracted to certain aspects of fascism while remaining on some level anti-colonial. And Rohana Kudus writes in New Left Review that Perindra promoted a model of family state organicism, quote, which would later inspire the Indonesian Armed Forces, Suharto's New Order, and now Gerindra, Prabowo's party. And I want to just emphasize this here because these are obviously major institutions and organizations that we will be returning to throughout the series. How do you all see the sort of politics of Perindra? Do you agree with this analysis in NLR that it really kind of creates this model of family state organicism that will be so influential throughout the rest of Indonesian history? And how should we think about this upper layer of the elite from the kind of lower elite that populate the nationalist, communist, and Islamic movements?
So I think that's so Parindra is an interesting party. I don't think its roots are in the 30s. It's actually rooted much deeper in the 1910s. The emergence of Budi Utomo, because in the early periods of the rise of Budi Utomo, because they were not exposed to Marxist analysis, a lot of the sort of discussion surrounding nationalism, and this wasn't Indonesian nationalism, but sort of emerging Javanese nationalism, stems from the need to sort of reinvigorate Javanese culture, right? So the idea is that colonialism has not destroyed, but sort of weakened the Javanese identity and the Javanese. So it was a cultural rejuvenation. And so on the nobility side, this notion of nationalism is very much related to cultural national rejuvenation of the Javanese. And this was helped by incorporating the emergence of Javanese history, like Majapahit as an empire, the old Javanese, which were being written in the middle to late 19th century. They sort of laid the groundworks for this sort of Javanese efflorescence. And so parts of that were translated into Parindra's, fascist or Indonesia Raya kind of imaginary. But the thing is, this isn't something that's purely amongst the nobilities. So even Sukarno, even some of the leftists are in support of this. So if you think about, for instance, Pancasila, if you think about Majapahit, if you think of the Indonesian flag, if you think of the rupiah and so forth, a lot of the imaginaries were from that sort of cultural rejuvenation of the Javanese. So under Sukarno, he actually pushed forth also that kind of thinking of Indonesia Raya. Our national anthem is Indonesia Raya, for instance. So this is the thing about Indonesia. It's very difficult to just group it into one. There's a lot of overlaps. So people from the left, from the Islamist party, some of them also accept the fact that parts of this ideas that were developed in the early 20th century by Budi Utomo relating to sort of cultural rejuvenation were accepted wholeheartedly. So Majapahit became sort of the mythical, historical basis for the Indonesian Republic. Although it's very right-wing in a sense if you think about it, but also left-wing people also supported the idea of Majapahit as the roots of Indonesian source of Indonesian historical pride and stuff. So yes, in the sense, Parindra is part of that. If you think about one other very important part for the development of Indonesia's corporatist ideas came from the Adat law school. Adat law is a creation of the Dutch of a Dutch legal scholar, Van Vollenhoven, who was also the major figure for the ethicist movement. He came from a German tradition of folkish law, which sees that laws are inherently within each society's historical experience. So I don't think you can say ethicist as left wing. And the Batavian Law Society, where the Adat group comes from, is the liberal wing of the European society. They had like this very famous group called the Stu, who is at the other end from the fascist like Vaderlandse Club or NSB. So they were the one who actually supports Indonesian independence, but they also support this kind of Adat corporatism. So again, Indonesia is a complicated place where right wing and left wing sometimes doesn't or becomes complicated in that manner.
I was wondering, Abi, if it's possible for us, instead of using the word fascist, to actually call Parindra conservative. And if we can make that differentiation between Parindra and the Indo-European fascist-leaning groups in the Indies, if there is a difference. Because the way I see Parindra is that they are organicists in language, right? They think about the nation as a harmonious family, unity over pluralism, leadership above conflict, that we see, continue to be used later on, including in the New Order era. But Parindra did not advocate for a totalitarian one-party rule, right? It did not build paramilitary movements. It did not promote racial supremacy. And it did operate within constitutional channels. So I don't think they were fascist in a European sense, but I would call them conservative rather than fascist. And if we think about it that way, are there any differences with the Indo-European groups that you mentioned, Abi?
I agree with you 100%, Anna. I didn't say that they were fascist, that they had fascist aesthetics. So they did try to emulate, say, a lot of the kind of fascist imaginary or groups. They did have like a semi-paramilitary group, Surya Wirawan, who also like sort of, you might consider it somewhat like brown shirts, but of course it's actually ridiculous if you think about it, because they're actually anti-colonial, but they have like these kind of sort of similarities in style, I guess. They also do the Nazi salute, to be honest. So there's a lot of these kind of fascist imagery. But the thing that's I think it's difficult to sort of separate is that if you think about corporatism, as I've discussed, it comes from Adat school. It comes from sort of the cultural rejuvenation that was brought on by the Budi Utomo and later on by people within the Javanese nationalist groups who were trying to revive Javanese nationalism in the 1910s, 1920s. And so it comes from various places, and it's used by various people, including by Sukarno and others, as the basis for Indonesian nationalism. So in that sense, that's where it becomes difficult to then pinpoint Parindra only as the source of corporatism. The appeal is much broader amongst Indonesian, including those in the left wing and in the right wing. Because if you think of Sukarno, then like the guided democracy is also a form of corporatism. So again, that's why it's very difficult. Indonesia is a difficult place politically to parse out, because it's just messy. Yeah.
It's an experimental minefield, People are continuously experimenting with big consequences.
I think that at that time, the idea, what we call it fascism right now, which is a very negative meanings. At that time, it's a things that pop culture, let's say like that. At that time, for example, in guerrilla itself, I think there's a lot of people who are basically they are Javanese. That's rejuvenating the Javanese ideal. That's most of them, and the chairman of the party, Dr. Sutomo, and then he died, and he replaced by another guy named R.P. Suroso, Raden Suroso, who is also a Javanese. And then in some of them, I don't know, probably Abby can correct me if I'm wrong. One of the most important person, the intellect behind Indonesian Constitution, Professor Supomo. This probably you will confuse this then because it's a Sutomo, but this is a Professor Supomo, the expert on adult law. I think he's he's the architect of, he's also affiliated with Parindra.
Adat law is customary or traditional law.
Customary traditional law, yeah. He's also the architect of the concept of Indonesian as a family state, the organic state. But also later on you will see the idea of these people from adat law and the idea from people outside Java. I think if you look at the making of Indonesian constitution in the meeting before the end of Japanese period, I think you will see that there's a lot of very huge differences between the Indonesian nationalism based on Javanese culture and Indonesian nationalism based on outside Javanese culture. For example, the status of Papua. Some of people inside the Badan Persiapan Kemerdekaan, the committee to prepare for Indonesian independence, argue that Papua should not belong to the new countries. But Indonesia, some other sides say that it should be incorporated to Indonesian country because of the imaginary of Majapahit, the great Indonesia. And this debate, we have this debate until now. The great Indonesia, which one? And then I think some part of traditionalist Islam right now start talking about not using Indonesia but using Nusantara, which is a little bit dangerous because Nusantara it will include Malaysia, it will include South Philippines, and this kind of imperialism mind in Indonesia, it's quite alive. Yeah.
I just want to add something also very important, right? So we know that in the long 1930s, there was repression. The repression was deepened, and leaders were arrested and exiled. And in fact, Sukarno was and Hatta were arrested, and then organizations were weakened. So what happened to the movement? As other movements such as Parindra was, turning into more cooperatist and cooperatist alignment. What happened to the revolutionary movement is that there was a shift from mobilization to political education. So the idea of Indonesia and a more revolutionary movement was sustained through print culture, through discussion circles and new intellectual currents. Like, there was study groups, there was press and pamphlets, there's cultural production, youth organizations. One great example of this, as we're talking about how essentially the left was non-existent, not non-existent, they were underground, they were fragmented, they were very weak. But the left actually survived. And when I say the left, the PKI, the Red Movement, survived through memories, through these printing cultures. One of the most important one was this novels, 5-volume novels called Pacar Merah Indonesia, or the Scarlet Pimpernel of Indonesia, that was written by Matu Mona, sometime published around 1938 to 1940. And this whole volumes are all about Tan Malaka and how he constantly faced dangers and enemies and traversed, different countries, China, Russia, the Philippines, Palestine, Iran, Germany. And he kept on somehow won in the face of these dangers. So what we are seeing in here is that this revolutionary zeal and determination for victory and eventually, for liberation continue to exist. In fact, still through memories of the Red Movement that later would be revived.
Before we move on, Abi, I have one more follow-up question for you. Why this turn to fascism in the Dutch East Indies, and specifically, Why is it that the Indos, people of mixed Indonesian and European ancestry who are in a awkward in-between position in the colonial racial hierarchy, why in particular are they attracted to fascism? It's rather normal, I think, for settlers in the colonialist class to turn towards forms of extremism. We've seen that in other settings throughout history. Why the Indos?
Yeah, well, there's two general strands within the European in the colony. This is a very generalized thing. So the first one supports the ethical policy, and the ethical policy is basically really democratization, the creation of the Volksraad, the creation of local government in the early 20th century. They expanded franchise to Indonesians, to various people, and there's this belief that within the ethicists that this was part of development of colonialism towards a new form that is more towards some form of nationalism, but one that would integrate Indonesians into the colonial project as something of a national project. But there were people who were against that, people who think that this was a grave mistake. A lot of people within the capitalist class think that it was a grave mistake because by allowing for the expansion of franchise, the development of democracy, it would create an Indonesian nationalism that would be counter to the colonial project. And the 1926 Communist Rebellion sort of made that. So it was the end of any of the ethicist influence, but they were already warning by 1921 afterwards. So it was a shift from that to an acknowledgement of Dutch imperialism, that it is an imperial project, that Indonesia is for Dutch capitalism and so forth. Now, the question of the Indo-European, so that would explain why the European class in Indonesia, which a lot of them are composed of what's called trekkers, so they're settlers. So they came from the Netherlands as expats, right? So they don't have like deep connection to Indonesia. They would then support a more right-leaning position. Why the Indo-Europeans? So the Indo-Europeans is an interesting category of class. The Indo-Europeans, they don't occupy the higher parts of Dutch capitalism, but some of the Indo-Europeans do occupy the higher parts of colonial bureaucracy. So their only path towards the middle class or upper class is to the state, so to become a bureaucrats, a colonial bureaucrat. They can't compete with Europeans at the higher capital level. They can't compete with Chinese at the lower capital level, if you can understand that. So they're not a capitalist class. Their only means towards is to become bureaucrats. And the major issue they have with the ethical policy is that it expanded Indonesian participation into the bureaucracy. So they see the Indonesian as their main competitor. And so they see that the way forward is for them to support. So actually, it's quite interesting. They want to be recognized as part of the European class. But the problem, this is maybe a bit too complex, but the problem with the Indo-Europeans is that they also want to be recognized as an Indonesian indigenous group because it provides access to land for them, different from the European class. So they're in this weird position in which they want to become settler, but they would lose privilege because of it. Many of them would move to the Netherlands in the 50s, despite their families being the Indo-European having families centuries in Indonesia. Their origin from the 17th century or 18th century or 19th century from Indonesia, and then they said, "Oh, let's go back to the Netherlands." But they're not Dutch people. They come to this like cold land and they don't know what they're doing. They're Indonesian, but they've decided to become Dutch because of their unfortunate position in colonial society. Yeah.
Before we get to the Japanese occupation, did those Dutch colonialists advocating a more repressive approach, did they have, on a practical level, did they have a point? Did the ethical policy backfire by sowing the seeds of independent and anti-colonial politics, just as the right-wing colonialists had charged it would from the beginning?
Yes, the short answer is yes. So the ethical policy, right, was aimed to correct the worst excesses of the cultivation system. And so I think we talked about how it was a crisis management, right? We should see it as a crisis management because essentially it did not want to promise any form of political equality or independence. But what they want to do is just to modernize the people, the Indonesian people, but they don't want to relinquish power. But the unintended consequences of that is that this policy, in fact, expanded Western education, Western style schooling, and produced new educated indigenous elites, right? So we talk about Tirto Adisuryo. So it produced Dutch educated indigenous bureaucrats, teachers, journalists, right? Students who went to the Netherlands. We talk about, Hatta and many other people. Actually, there were also working class people who studied in Europe, like in the communist era, like Sumantri, who actually went to Leiden University and then went to Kutv in Russia and then wrote a thesis in French, for instance. just to tell you how there was this expansion of opportunity to study in Europe for people, not just of a more wealthier background, but also working class. And then there was also politically literate youth. And I mentioned all of this because these were the architect of nationalism. And this is why then suddenly it erupted, this zeal of nationalism and also anti-colonial spirit showed up. Because in a sense, the ethical policy. And you're seeing also, yes, maybe it was to some extent was triggered by the PKI revolt in 1926 to 27, that the Dutch government actually produced this regulation and law that were repressing associations and assembly, repressing printing press repression. And also in 1932, there was this thing called the Wildescholen Ordonnantie, which basically banned any wild schools, ordinance against wild schools. Wild schools as in schools that were created not by the Dutch governments and not funded by the Dutch government. They were not allowed, they were banned. And then there was Die Gul, right, where this concentration camp was invented exactly because of the revolt in 1926-27. But later on, also any radical organizers were sent there. So yeah, Bovendigul is in West Papua. It's malaria-ridden, and it was basically not possible to. A lot of people essentially died because of just the environmental condition there, because there was a lot of sickness and malaria, and there was not really institution, like there's not really like hospitals. There's nothing like that. It was just a concentration camp in an area that was very dangerous for actually humans to live. And then, of course, these people who were moved there were Javanese, right? They're not accustomed to live in such a barren area. Of course, there were indigenous Papuans who lived there, and they already built their own systems and networks of traditional medicines and all kinds of that. But these people did not have access to that either.
Yeah, I think I'm fascinated with Abby's explanation of the Indos. I just want to remind everybody that the legacy of that Indo who moved to the Netherlands in the 50s, I think is still there. And you got now in the Dutch politics, the very famous name Geert Wilders. He's an Indo.
Exactly.
He's an Indo. So he's a far right. Is just consistent with his ancestors.
Wow.
I heard that the current Dutch Prime Minister, who is gay, is also from Indo background. So
and also, if you want to, after the war, when the Dutch want to come back to Indonesia, they have a headache. What to do with these Indos? They are not, if Indonesians become independent, they are not fitted in Indonesia, they are not fitted in in the Netherlands eaters, and they're quite sizable in number. I think around 100,000 at the time. And that has an idea to make West Guinea, which is now West Papua, become the place for these Idos. So they started to build so many infrastructure for that. For example, in the South Papua, the first rice project, because this Indo cannot eat bread, they eat rice because they live in Indonesia. So the Dutch started to create the rice field. I've been there a couple of times. It still exists until now with all of the irrigation to prepare that these people will live in Papua, become settlers in Papua. So Papua, at that time, that's why the Dutch insisted in when the diplomacy with Indonesia in 1949, they insisted that West Papua, West Guinea, it will not be part of Indonesia. But later on, with the nationalist movement and Sukarno's provocation, it becomes part of Indonesia. So that's how close the Indo with the West Papua, and then they went to the Netherlands, and now they dominate the politics in the Netherlands. That's quite fascinating story.
Yeah.
That was Rianne Subijanto, Made Supriatma, and Farabi Fakih for episode 2 of Nusantara, a series on the history of Indonesia. Rianne Subijanto is a professor of communication studies at Baruch College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's the author of Communication Against Capital, Red Enlightenment at the Dawn of Indonesia, and a co-editor of The Indonesian Left in the 20th Century, Beyond the Rise and Fall of a Party. She also serves as an editor for the Indonesian left media Indoprogress.com. Made Supriatma is a visiting research fellow at the Isaias Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. He specializes in Indonesian politics, civil-military relations, ethnic conflict, and state bureaucracy. Farabi Fakih is the head of the master's program in the history department of Gadjah Mada University in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. He's worked on the history of the decolonization of the Indonesian state and is working on a manuscript on the history of natural resource management, particularly oil and gas. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but, on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thea Riofrancos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram at The Dig Radio. And please do find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this one. If it's on iTunes or Spotify or wherever, please rate and review us glowingly. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really and truly does that is you telling people to check out this pod. IRL, online, posting, verbalizing it, whatever. Please make propaganda for us and do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.